Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. The Last Dinosaur is the podcast where you can learn about the changing landscape of the maritime space while hearing from those that are leading that change. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Captain's Table podcast being brought to you in collaboration with myself and The Last Dinosaur. Today's guest is Roberto Giannetta, chairman at Hong Kong Liner Shipping Association. Roberto has more than 2 decades of experience in Asia and is an active voice in the liner shipping community in Hong Kong. Roberto, thank you for coming on the pod.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're doing and kind of a little bit about, how you got to where you are now in Hong Kong and with the Liner Association.
I think it's one of those things that one did not plan, but then it worked out this way and I have zero regrets. I grew up being able to travel around the world a little bit, born in Brazil from Italian parents, and I saw Europe and South America and North America, and I had always been interested in the Far East, the mysterious Far East. So I had the opportunity to work in Macau in 1986. That was my entry into Asia. After a year in Korea, I then ended up getting a job in Hong Kong in 1989 on April Fool's Day, which was, I was expecting something very different, but ended up being very pleased in the shipping industry. To be able to be here, to have been able to see the last 35 years, this has been a monumental period in current history that it's been so exciting to be able to see this, not only from the commercial perspective, but just what has happened historically. My background was interestingly, in system information technology. And I was hired by an organization to migrate their tariffs from a text-based system to a database system. This was at the time when the ATFI system, the U.S. government was changing their filing mechanism from a text-based to a database system. And so my job was to migrate the 60,000 pages of tariffs from text to digital for digital updates. And I never really wanted to stay in the tech industry. And it was something that I decided to do because I couldn't decide if I wanted to go into teaching, business, research, or whatever. And I saw the shipping industry and I thought, wow, this is a pretty exciting industry. And so I got in and I said, okay, I'll do this project for you. But after the 2-3 years to get it set up, I want to switch over to the commercial side. At that time, the Hong Kong is a dominant place, but it was the number one port in the world in terms of volume. And the Liner Shipping Association was a very big entity here. And I started getting involved in that in 1993. And I then stepped in as chairman since 2019. So, yeah, it's one of those things that kind of comes by, and I think I can't let this one go. It's too good. Too much fun has happened. Basically, the Liner Shipping Association is a group of all of the major container liner operators globally. That means all of the shipping lines that provide services on regular scheduled rotations, sort of like a bus service, versus different types of shipping that would be taxi, like port-to-port type of things. The container liner industry is responsible for 85% of global trade, and we cover in the association all types of issues from safety, operations, efficiencies, trade policies, basically everything except for commercial and competitive issues. And we basically serve the interests of the principals of those shipping lines, so be those based in Copenhagen, Geneva, Singapore, wherever they are in the world. Lately, we've been covering a lot of issues around decarbonization, digitalization, efficiency gains, connectivity. Yeah, basically putting out fires wherever they come up, which is quite often in shipping. Not literal fires, but always challenges that need to be worked around. So yeah, that's how I got into this industry.
Fascinating path. And one of the things that so many questions that I have, firstly, one of the things that I love to tell people is, I actually come from the other side of the business, and that is the bulk side. So what I tell them, I basically say the liner shipping is like your bus. If you go stand out in the street and it says it's going to be there at 2:00, bus generally, depends on who you are, generally is there at 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
And it's going to take you to the store and drop you off. And then if you want to come home, you go across the street for the other bus stop and it'll, at 3 o'clock and do that. And that's how I explain the concept of liner. And the way I explain the concept of bulk, I explain that more along the lines of a Uber driver. That Uber driver could come pick you up, drive you into, I live in Connecticut, so Stamford. And then he or she can find another job maybe right around the corner from Stamford, or maybe they have to drive 4 miles to the next town over to get their desired fare back, which gets into kind of basically what bulk shipping does, right? It's you have a lot of options on load and discharge depending on the size of the ship, and this is not the forum for that. But generally, you have a lot of flexibility, and you don't know where the ship's going to be 6 months from now. Whereas with liner service, you pretty much know that ship's going to be sitting in Rotterdam 6 months.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
So that's basically how I explain it. You do bring up the real dynamic change that you've seen in Hong Kong, and at the same time, the shipping world in the past 35 years. You kind of bring this up, and I love to talk more about this, is the whole decarbonization aspect of it, and liner services being in a little bit of an advantage in the sense of they know their ports like we just talked about. Talk a little bit about, the things that you're hearing and kind of the approach, because I do believe that the liner services are going to be at the forefront of this decarbonization charge just from the sake of ease and knowing where their ships are and being able to adjust to fuel sources or adjust to other things that both companies have a little bit more difficulties doing so, or really not difficulties, challenges.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Chris. Because the liner services are on regular port calls, we know that, it'll be Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then Middle East, and then Rotterdam. We know exactly where the ship is going to be over the course of at least while that service isn't being deployed. And so we're able to plan and schedule where we take on fuel, where we do all of our service maintenance on the vessels. So that does create an opportunity for the liner industry to be a little bit on the forefront of this decarbonization trajectory. Quite a lot is already happening in that regard. For the layman out there, just a little bit, maybe a background. I think basically global trade in maritime covers more than 90% of all goods and services. And it is already the most efficient and greenest form of transportation. Yet, shipping does represent 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions. This is not a whole lot if you consider, for example, a global electricity generation is 30 to 25. But yet, nonetheless, it is a significant part of what needs to be addressed in terms of global warming. And the shipping lines are taking this responsibility seriously. We do have an international authority that oversees global ships, all the oceans of the world, and that's basically the United Nations International Maritime Organization. And the IMO have set targets to achieve zero or net zero emissions by 2050. And so there's already been quite a bit of a shift in operations and propulsion technology that is available commercially that shipping lines are looking at. There are many ways that we can begin to decarbonize. That's through power-saving devices such as solar or LED, waste heat recovery. There's hydrodynamic areas where we can, for example, do hull cleaning or install rudder bulbs, high-efficiency propellers, etc. Aerodynamic tools like wind kites, rigid sails. But even with all of these, we cannot achieve the IMO target without addressing the propulsion fuel. So the technology is evolving that does enable ships to move on green fuel. It is still in not a totally commercial environment yet because the technology is still evolving. Some of the fuel options still do have methane slips, or it doesn't quite address even a 50% emission reduction. So this is a moving target. But we are already seeing that many ships are being built that can accommodate green fuel. And that's a lot of our members. At the moment, for example, new builds are at a record high. We see approximately 50 vessels hitting the oceans every single month on an average, equivalent to 11,000 containers per day. That's the typical voyage of a trans-Pacific vessel from Asia to Europe, 11,000 TEUs. Another way to look at it is this would be the entire fleet of PIL, who is the 12th ranking biggest shipping company, on a weekly basis being put out onto sea. So there is quite a lot being done. A lot of the vessels, well, all of the vessels have dual fuel capabilities. The leading one that we have seen that started coming out 10 years ago or so is LNG. But LNG does not allow us to achieve anything more than about 30% GHG reductions. Other options include methanol. Methanol at the moment is actually vying LNG in terms of new builds. They're going to become the most common vessel propulsion type on the oceans pretty soon. But even methanol, I think, will be superseded by ammonia, which is another option. But that's further down the line. Probably we won't see that technology evolve enough until maybe the 2040s or so. At the moment, we also see a number of drop-in biofuels that are becoming very common as a transition path. But all of these fuels, all of these different technologies are actually only stopgap. They don't get us to what we really want, which is a circular economy with truly zero emissions across the whole platform. And in my opinion, this is just me throwing something out there on the wall and see if it sticks. I think that what we would ultimately be looking at are small modular nuclear reactors. Molten salt reactors, for example, look like they would be ideal candidates for the shipping industry. And I think that this would be ultimately the end game. But until then, we do have to move forward. And I think each fuel type has its advantages and disadvantages. Across the board, though, the big issue is the cost. The cost of the green fuel is around 4 times the price of fossil fuel, and the efficiency ratio is half at best of what fossil fuel is. So you need double the volume of green fuel to cover the same distance that you would with fossil fuel, and that double the fuel that you buy is 4 times the price. So this is a pretty big obstacle. This is hampering the production of the fuel. And I think globally, my perception is that the supply of green fuel is only about 2% of what the current global shipping demand is. That would be the ships that are green fuel capable on the oceans already. So what the Liner Shipping Association is trying to do is a number of areas. We're trying to narrow the gap or look at ways that we can narrow the price gap, be that through cooperation in both the private and the public sector. We're trying to help the shipping lines and the producers and the suppliers and the storage people make the connections that are necessary in order to streamline the supply chain for these green fuels. We believe that at least in the first 10, 15 years, China will be one of the predominant producers of green fuel. China has the capability, the resources, natural resources, also the bio-waste. They're the number one bio-waste producer in the world. They have the capability to be able to turn key production of green fuel at a pretty fast pace, at least faster than many of the other economies and jurisdictions that are, of course, looking at producing green fuel as well. So if that's the case, we're right on the backyard of where this green fuel is going to be produced. So we're looking at how we can get the green fuel that is being produced in inner China, inner Mongolia, Xinjiang province, in the western part of China, southern part of China, how we can get that fuel to the rest of the world, because not all ships go to China, right? And so we need to make sure that this green fuel is where the ships are going to be so that they can take on this fuel as bunkering for their propulsion. So that's one of the things that we're doing in this area.
Thank you so much for that real comprehensive kind of outlook. And I think you touched a lot of things, and I appreciate you addressing kind of maybe some of the people who are new to the podcast or new to the industry, is that yes, the IMO, or International Maritime Organization, the one that governs shipping in general. It governs everything from safety, SOLAS, safety of life at sea, to these sort of kind of environmental and pollution regulations. For everybody's knowledge, I think it's sometime in this year, there is a fairly large and going to be well-publicized meeting that will further address some of these regulations around timing, especially in the short-in period, I believe out to 2030, with respect to decarbonization in the industry. And it'll probably be one of the bigger news stories this year in general in shipping, barring, something else happening. But keep your eye out on that, because that's going to dictate a lot of what's happening, especially in the next few years, for associations like yours and other people and shippers and ship owners and charterers, especially in the near future.
And the IMO certainly have a path that they're trying to carve out. And you're right, they do have regular meetings of the MEPC, of this committee that is looking at maritime emissions. But with the membership as big as the UN is, hundreds of countries, many of them, these small Pacific islands, to the major fuel producers, to the consumers, to the buyers, it is difficult to get everybody on the same page at the same time. And what we see is that there are different jurisdictions that are like getting tired of waiting for the IMO. For example, the EU are already carving out a path, a trajectory, a journey. The US was one of the early ones setting environment emission regions, areas. One of the challenges then for the people involved in the global trade is, how do we comply with a number of different standards and different targets and different goalposts? So that's something that we need to be aware of. But certainly following somebody like the IMO would help bring in standardization requirements, guidelines that would make life much easier for everybody. But it is a slow journey.
It is. And I've actually had on in 2023, and I think in 2022, I had on one of the representatives who sits on that committee, Nick McCarr, and he works for the Marshall Island flag. And Nick, came on and talked about this process, and it's easy for people to say, oh, it's flawed, it's not good, it doesn't do, what it's supposed to do. But Nick's like, listen, and I think you alluded to this, Roberto, we got a lot of people in the room and we got stuff going in the right direction. And it takes a lot to do that, because people just don't realize, like you said, you have hundreds of voices plus industry, kind of contributing in there in the background and making the case and all the things that go along with a large multilateral, to put it politely.
Yeah, very true. But it takes a village. It takes a village. And I think our village is 200 some countries.
Yeah, it is. Plus, you throw in, like I said, some of the trade associations, other people who have, you could criticize and say, well, they only look out for them. But I think that one thing about maritime that I've learned over my career is that, yeah, people do look out for their interests, but interests generally align, because you're all trying to do the same thing. And that's, the old adage of moving 90% of everything. One of the things that kind of goes hand in hand with decarbonization is digitalization. And we've seen this across the board, and the pace of digitalization. And the tongue-in-cheek name for this podcast is The Last Dinosaur, because basically, we are the last industry to really embrace digitalization across the board. This must be something that comes up with your members and in the community. I'd love to hear your point of view and kind of some of the things that you're doing now at the Liner Association. And also, I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of the evolution of thought, because you've been involved in the industry and you started off on IT a while ago. I'd love to hear that perspective as well, because I think there's a lot of interesting value in hearing.
Yeah, sure. A lot is happening in the space of digitization. I think what a lot of different stakeholders, they see that there is a value in going digital for their own systems. And so they look early on, when not only shipping industry, but all industries started digitizing. Applications within an organization become more apparent and very easy to see. And so a lot of digitized systems were developed that focus on the specific needs of that individual shipping company or individual terminal or customs department. And those systems remain pretty much siloed. Interoperability is very low in our industry, but yet the applications are enormous. Some of the ones that we're looking at more so than, of course, the transfer of data are applications for autonomous systems. And talking about decarbonization, autonomous systems would actually help reduce fuel consumption through optimizing routes and determining when the decision maker should switch fuel. But challenges around assurance and the large costs associated with the new technology means that these systems are moving forward very slowly. Autonomous systems could also help address staffing and recruitment. Smaller crew on vessels means that there's fewer personnel at risk. But ensuring, again, the safety of autonomous capabilities remains a challenge. We've been seeing autonomous and remote systems being used in terminals around Asia. This is something that I see as still a little bit of a challenge in North America, where the terminals workers, longshoremen, are struggling to understand how autonomous systems can help them without taking away their jobs. But in Asia, we have seen that autonomous systems are actually helping improve efficiency that increases cargo volume. That means that the jobs are actually not being cut out. So there's a number of areas. AI in terms of crew training or technical operations or dangerous exercises on board the ship, even before they're on board. These are all areas that we see a lot of potential. But of course, the scope of these systems should always consider the entire life cycle of the maritime industry, because ultimately, and this is my opinion, the objective of automation is, one, to make ships safer, and two, to help the decision makers improve efficiency of global trade. So one of the things that the Liner Shipping Association is doing is working together with, again, private and public sector to look at regulations and standards around AI and machine learning so that these evolve in a positive manner. Of course, there is a challenge that regulations covering AI and ML will vary across sectors and jurisdictions, just like we're talking about the decarbonization trajectory. IMO, again, is working on regulations for autonomous ships, and they've been doing this for a long time. But again, as we were just saying, because of the large membership, this is a very slow-moving target. Same time, same as we're saying in decarbonization, individual nations are also creating their own rules to expedite the introduction of maritime autonomy within their waters. And this, of course, then creates a difficulty in compliance when there's so many different systems. There are entities that are working to try to bring some symmetry, bring some standards into place. For example, the Digital Container Shipping Association, DCSA, they're doing a lot to, for example, even standardize terminology. When we talk about
on the BLs, I think that's one of their first big things. I think they're looking at as well.
Absolutely. And that's one area that I would love to see come into fruition soon. In the industry, we actually thought that COVID was going to be the catalyst that we needed to spur this increase in digitization, but the movement uptick in digital maritime operations has been very slow. But the key fundamental processes still require reliance on paper documents for legal and regulatory frameworks, be that a physical signature or proof of authenticity of original documents. Many jurisdictions basically require trade documents, such as letter of credit or custom declarations, to be submitted in manual paper-based form. And this is a precondition for shipments to be able to be approved. These documentations they could require up to 50 pages of documents, and they need to be exchanged by 30 different stakeholders. Just not only the BLs, bills of lading, but also delivery orders. You have the engagement of the banks, you have the freight forwarders, the shipper, the cargo, the owner, the ship itself, the terminals, and the complexity is multiplied. If we could only start moving the bar and making the ability for the industry to use digital signatures, digital recognition, this would really be tremendous. At the moment, the shipping industry, our members are actually ready to move forward with this. But even today, with what we have, digital bills of lading apply for only 1.2% of global worldwide shipments. So we have a long road ahead of us, but I think that this is definitely one of the areas where we should be able to see some success, I hope, soon.
I agree. I think that I had somebody on from a company called Secro, and they're working on that challenge of the digital bill of lading. There was a lot of hope because, like, as you addressed, there are some jurisdictions, I believe that England, I think France, I'm pretty sure Singapore, maybe a couple of others have started to accept these bills of lading digital as, as part of the trade documentation, which is definitely a step in the right direction. And you also bring up a really interesting topic, and that is the fear, and not just necessarily with, of course, longshoremen or other folks, but the fear in general, and certainly people on ship, that digitalization and AI and machine learning and automation is going to take away jobs. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how in Asia you've addressed that, because I know, like in the U.S., we're about a couple of days away from the union and the shippers agreeing that they'll go forward, at least put the deal that came in hand to the rank and file of the union members. So barring a change, it should go through and a strike should be averted. But it doesn't, I'm not sure how much it addresses this idea of automation and efficiency. And it's obviously a double-edged sword. People are worried about their jobs and their pensions and their health care. And at the same time, companies want to be more efficient for a lot of reasons. Money, yes, but also more efficient means hopefully a lesser footprint. So there's a lot of different factors there. I'd love to hear kind of how the approach has been in other ports where you've seen this enacted, but yet maybe the job loss wasn't as catastrophic or even happened at all.
Yeah, I think where I was describing the automation was particularly at the terminals. There are, in Asia, more and more terminals are being operated by remote control. So the cranes, stevedoring services are being done by robotics. And there is a technician that is sitting in a room that has 6 cranes on his monitor and a joystick in front of him. And what he needs to do is just tap and confirm that the crane is securely captured for lifting or discharging. And that's a pretty simple process. There are also autonomous drivers, trucks around the terminals that are moving the containers, stacks. There's a lot of applications that we see in the terminals. In terms of bills of lading, auto BLs, and delivery orders, I think Asia is probably further behind than some of the other jurisdictions in this regard. And it's because a lot of the shipping business being done in Asia are small shippers. They're not the Walmarts or the Kohl's. They are just small entities that sometimes they have just a little back office with one computer. A lot of shipments that come out of Southeast Asia, Vietnam. Well, Vietnam is progressing. Indonesia, Bangladesh. There's many places that have a limited IT access, even the internet. That's not only the shippers' offices, but even banks. Another issue that is an obstacle is this one of standardization.
This is standardization. Sorry to interrupt here, but one of the big things, standardization around a noon report. It's like, holy smokes.
Yeah. Well, like I was just started saying earlier, even on time, when a vessel arrival, what does on time mean or arrival mean? Does it mean when the ship enters the port? Does it mean when it enters the water? Does it mean when it's docked? Does it mean when the cargo has been offloaded? Does it mean when the cargo has been checked by customs? There really is no standard in defining what is on time schedule. And yet we have these global reports that say, rate every shipping line ABC on their on-time reliability. Of course, they're all at an all-time low at the moment because of issues with the Red Sea or whatever else. But these definitions really are the first step in moving us forward in terms of digitization. Once we have the definitions, then we can talk about standardizing those applications and having similar platforms. Even within Singapore and Hong Kong and China, very advanced. I would say, let's say even Hong Kong and China, they're brothers, right? And even the systems that we have, government systems, are completely different platforms. There's very little movement of data around in the shipping circles. The government documents that are still required, even in Hong Kong, a certificate of origin, some of the custom declarations, letters of credit, many banks still require that. This is a long road.
One of the things you brought up earlier, which comes up over and over again, especially on the liner side, is the historical systems that a lot of these big companies have built that are kind of for their services only. And now you have so many of these different ones. And then the interoperability and the standardization of the wording and verbiage amongst all those systems is definitely a challenge that on the liner side is something that is going to need to be overcome as well. And I'm sure it's one of the topics that you talk about with your association.
Well, when I first started, I mentioned to you I was in IT and I was trying to set up the system so that we could update tariffs electronically to Washington, D.C., FMC. The challenge at that time was that there was no single system for communication over the airways. Emails. Everybody had an email system, but it was only for their own company. And it wasn't really until Microsoft came out with a standard that became very popular, IBM, together with IBM, and everybody started applying that standard, that version of emails. And that's where we then started being able to talk to each other. And so I think we need something like that to get us over this hump now. We need somebody to step forward. In the 80s, it was the U.S. That stepped forward. Will the U.S. step forward again and give us some standards that will be able to be applied in terms of these shipping documents? We need somebody to take a lead. But yeah, I think that's what really is needed to get us on the same page, figurative and literal.
I agree. We could talk about that topic for a long time. But as we wrap up here, we tried to get this discussion earlier, and you were traveling a lot. One of the questions I absolutely love to ask: what books are you reading today? If you travel a lot and have to go to a lot of different association meetings, and maybe they're not all in Hong Kong and they're different areas. And by the way, reading can be audiobook. I started my first audiobook at the gym the other day. It was pretty good. I'll give a review on that at some point. But anything that you throw in your bag or you have on your Kindle or iPad that's of interest these days.
Yeah, I do love reading. I never got into audiobooks. Even the Kindle I tried for a while. I kind of like the hard copy. I love historical novels with international trade. What interested me in Asia to begin with was books like Shogun, Taipan, 1421, those type of things. And so I have a lot of books that are on my to-read pile. I have one from an old friend of mine that you probably know, Peter Levesque, that was the president of Port Americas. Most recently, he was the president of CMA America. Yeah, so I have these books that are sitting there. But you know what I'm reading now? It's not for pleasure, but it's because I need to update myself. Books on decarbonization, innovation, efficiency ratings, technical understanding. And it's more of something that I need to do because I need to be able to understand this in order to do my job. And it is exciting, but it's not it would not be my comfort book that I pull out.
Maybe if you need to fall asleep on the plane, you read a couple of pages and go to bed. I tell you, that's really funny. I had an admiral on who was in charge of like regulations and stuff, and U.S. Coast Guard admiral, and he mentioned that he's in charge of a lot of these things, and he's an engineer by training. And he tells me, he goes, I'm reading all these new engineering specs. He goes, I love it. I'm like, better you than me, because I would probably fall asleep. Boy. I guess people gravitate to jobs that they're good at. He got excited about engineering specs. So that was kind of interesting.
Well, if you enjoy your work, you never work a day in your life or something like that.
Well,
right?
that's very true. And I know that a lot of people have found their way into the maritime space and kind of take that look. Roberto, thank you so much for sharing kind of your view from your career, your view from the evolution of the container industry, your career, Hong Kong. It was a really great chat. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time out. And I know the time discrepancy is not always easy to overcome.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me.